How's it going, everybody? My name is Chet Monday. I'm the Director of Youth Engagement with the March for Science, and I'm joined by Cynthia Leung, a wonderful youth activist based in Brooklyn, New York, currently active with Extinction Rebellion Youth in New York City. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining me, and I just wanted to hand it over and give it to you to have a little brief background about yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Leung, and I am a 16-year-old organizer based in New York City. I first began climate activism because of multiple reasons, one being that I was introduced to it while advocating for mental health and illnesses at the United Nations as a youth representative, and also because I saw the impact that colonialism had on the environment. Victoria Harbor was used as the major port for imports and exports during British rule, leading to the contaminated seafood and water. While visiting Hong Kong as a young child, I remembered having difficulty breathing due to the gargantuan amounts of air pollution that exists on the island. Not being able to visit led to me losing almost part of my touch with the culture and losing contact with my family a little. The spirit of capitalism and industrialization has drastic effects on the human population. Due to my experiences being Asian American, I prioritize POC inclusion in my climate work. At this time with the COVID pandemic, we need unity and solidarity for systemic change. Society has had its flaws, but this disease just exposed them. Not only do we need more young people on the front lines of the movement, but we need more young people of color involved in the conversations. It's outlandish that although New York City is extremely diverse, the climate scene here isn't. During the summer of 2019, I spent hours in the library scouring through law books, seeing what impact I could make on local legislation. While coming across the education section of the New York State law, I realized that climate education needed to be implemented as a mandatory curriculum. After speaking with a couple of other youth activists, I reached out to local officials about the idea. One state senator saw it as a great idea, so then came the research and mobilization process. Recently, I created an initiative to provide scientific content for youth climate organizers to establish the bridge between the youth climate movement and the science community. The whole project is led by women and majority women of color. Every movement needs inclusion to create space for more individuals to join. And most of all, humanity is visibly torn apart. There needs to be POC unity because issues like climate change and institutional oppression were created by the same oppressive system that publicly endorsed imperialism and profit. To alleviate one issue, we could also concentrate on the foundation of these problems.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Cynthia. And I wanted to ask you a few questions. You have a wonderful written article in Vice about the inclusion and diversity that this movement needs. Could you talk a little bit more about what diversity brings to the table in terms of a movement and why it's so necessary to have, especially in the climate space?
So we in XR Youth, we also talk a little bit about just representation and tokenization within the climate movement. And although, for example, we do see a little bit of youth climate organizers that are POC that are represented in the media, we also don't necessarily feel like we are being listened to. And countless amounts of movements that have been discussed and commentated around in US history textbooks, such as, I would say, the women's movement, or even when we talk about the New Deal, a lot of these different movements and policies excluded people of color. The New Deal that was pushed by FDR, it excluded African Americans, and even for women's suffrage, it excluded a lot of women of color. And a lot of these textbooks forget about the fact that a lot of women of color, especially African American women, they were allowed to vote 2 years later, and Latinx and Asian women were only allowed to vote, I would say, around the 1950s. So in order to have not extreme, but I would say full social change and climate justice, we need to have all communities involved because there is no social climate justice without social justice. And in order for there to be social justice, every community needs to be represented.
Wonderful. And if you had to say something to those leaders of organizations in the movement to enforce that unity, what would you tell them in order to create spaces for young people of color to join the movement?
Well, I would say that there's multiple ways that these leaders could be having more POC to be on the front lines of the movement. One being if, for example, if there are youth activists of color that have very specific points that they want to get across. For example, one thing that I think that a lot of youth activists should be pushing for that still needs representation on is POC solidarity and unity, as shown by the countless amounts of racism towards Asian Americans and even the discrimination that's going on in China. There hasn't been a lot of people talking about these different issues, and we need like POC activists talking about these issues, because again, all of these issues are connected to climate change. And I feel that a lot of these leaders do have opportunities to give media opportunities to their own members that are POC, but they choose not to. And I feel that a lot of organizations publicly endorse the idea of POC inclusion, but in reality, they're not necessarily implementing it. And it's really lethal to not be taking part in that.
Absolutely. So could you please just dive back into some of the initiatives you're working on and how viewers can support you?
Well, one of the initiatives that I'm working on right now is actually a science communication initiative meant to bridge the gap between the youth climate movement and the science community. And the reason why I kind of started this was because I go to Brooklyn Tech, and it's a very STEM-based school. And I've noticed how, like, even going to the Climate Coalition meetings every Wednesday, it was usually me and this other kid that was from my school that went to these meetings, even though it was around like, there's like 6,000 kids in my school, which is crazy, because we do need scientists to communicate with youth activists. And so in order for there to be almost just like full momentum for this movement, I definitely feel like there needs to be a little bit of more communication, because not all people my age could be able to understand the academic articles that are published by academics and academia. And in order for there to be support for movements like these and like to help initiatives like mine, I feel that there could be a little bit of more people just trying to help with science communication, academics, just being able to almost like, I mean, it's like almost just like not dumbing down the information, but just translating it so that every age group can be able to understand it. Because the type of content that a lot of like academia publishes, there aren't like 6-year-olds or like middle schoolers or high schoolers. There isn't content that is universally understood. And it's really important because there's children as young as, I would say, 6 years of age or 8 years of age that join these movements. And so we need more communication.
Definitely. And that accessibility is the bottom line, right? And you talk about that so much, especially in your wonderful article. So thank you for touching on that. And one last question. What advice would you give to any youth that are looking into activism and becoming an activist?
I would say that there's multiple things that I would say to other youth activists my age, but it's more of just not really, like, just don't stick to the status quo and don't be afraid to speak up, because, for example, in sociology, we're learning about stereotype threat and how stereotype threat almost just utilizes negative stereotypes to make sure that it's almost like students and young people can conform to these negative stereotypes based off of the belief that they will conform to these stereotypes, which is, it's not a good definition, but I didn't know how to phrase it right off the bat. But I would just say, like, yeah, definitely just don't conform, don't stick to the status quo. You have to like get your voice out there, especially if you do have interesting points, if there are points that you want to get across. Don't be afraid to message anyone that you want. Like, don't be afraid to message local officials, don't be afraid to message media, don't be afraid to even have other activists as a support group, because like at the end of the day, we are all achieving the same goal. And that's why the activism scene is almost just amazing in its own different way, because everyone here is just friendly with each other. We're all friends. And at the end of the day, again, we're all just trying to support each other.
Definitely creating that reciprocity that will move forward this movement Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. Everybody, please support her however you can. And I want to welcome back to the stage the co-chairs of March for Science New York City, Omar and Ingrid, and the executive director of Earth Day Initiative, John, and also the executive director of March for Science, Valeria Aquino. Take it away.